Has post-Cold War expansion weakened NATO? Is there a way to ensure unanimous Article 5 support? NATO is back at the forefront of European security discussions as the Ukraine war has shaken many of the European member states out of their decades-long security slumber. The demise of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War marked the beginning of the slumber as Russia grappled with collapse of the communist economic system and the Europeans eagerly reaped the benefits of their peace dividend. Both events resulted in sharp decline in defense spending across Europe and North America, prompting questions about the continued necessity of NATO. While the question remained unanswered, NATO, akin to any other government program, persevered and repurposed itself during this period and between the end of the Cold War and the Ukraine War. Is NATO as strong as it was at the end of the Cold War despite surviving and expanding? 12 founding nations established NATO in 1949 with the aim of safeguarding Western Europe against the Soviet threat in Eastern Europe. Article 5 serves as the foundation of NATO's strength and collective defense. Article 5 basically stipulates that an attack on one member nation is considered an attack on all member nations, and the members are to come to the defense of the attacked nation. The strength and the commitment to Article 5 are what have made NATO the longest-lasting and most successful defense alliance in history. The Soviet threat to Western Europe was the foundation of what held the member nations together in NATO's common defensive bond. The Soviet threat is what made the commitment to Article 5 so ironclad and beyond questioning by the NATO member countries. The post-Cold War question for NATO is, without the Soviet threat, was there a purpose for a defensive security alliance? Supporters of NATO continued the existence were never able to effectively answer this question, so the debate simmered from 1991 after the dissolution of the Soviet Union to 2014 and the Russians' first invasion of Ukraine. NATO's creation aimed to deter war through an effective use of credible collective defense, a strategy that proved successful. Once the Soviet army left Eastern Europe and returned to European Russia, there was no longer a credible threat to NATO. NATO had no obvious purpose. Supporters of NATO will be unwilling to allow it to cease existing, whether that is through foresight or an inability to allow a government project to end. Supporters promoted NATO as both a security alliance and a defense alliance. It found a ready audience in Eastern Europe as well as among members of the former Soviet bloc. In the final months of World War II, Moscow established and supported governments that later controlled most of Eastern Europe. When the Soviet Union began to lose control of its Eastern European bloc, these countries suffered much of the same post-communist economic pain as Russia. As these countries began to establish democratic governments and forge new relationships with Western European countries, their need for security from Russia, as well as the return of Russian influence and control over their newly gained independence, created an opportunity for NATO's post-Cold War goals. The former Soviet bloc countries had a desire to prevent Russia from re-exerting control over their governments. NATO expansion into these former Eastern European countries could provide the security to prevent Russia's return. Russia could not threaten the former Soviet bloc countries if NATO Article 5 protections were enforced. Russia would not risk a war with its former bloc countries if it meant a war with NATO. So despite no actual physical threat, but only a theoretical threat from Russia, NATO started its eastward expansion and by doing so pushed its borders ever closer to Russia. The former Soviet bloc countries received security they needed, and NATO had a new purpose and more influence than ever as its membership increased from 12 to 32 nations. Despite the fact that most member states maintain defense spending levels well below what is required for credible readiness, NATO is now stronger than ever against any potential European threat. This just demonstrated how weak any potential threat was in Europe. That questionable readiness still provided enough security to NATO members to deter any threat from non-NATO countries on the continent. The short-lived Ukraine war of 2014 served as a wake-up call for parts of Europe, but it did not pose a significant threat due to the continent's continued low defense budget expenditures. Even after agreeing to allocate 2% of their GDP to defense, it was also not enough for European countries to stop importing cheap and plentiful Russian energy in the form of oil and gas. The wake-up call came in 2022, and the much larger Russian invasion of Ukraine in February positioned NATO at the forefront of European security and collective defense, with its new eastern frontiers on or near the Russian border. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg visited the United States and Canada between June 17th and the 21st, 2024, and reported that 23 of 32 NATO countries are meeting their agreed-upon 2014 target of 2% of their GDP on defense. The 9 countries that are not meeting this target are Belgium, Canada, Croatia, Italy, Luxembourg, Slovenia, and Spain. Discussions on NATO capabilities and deterrence has focused on military spending and acquisition as it races to deter Russia from threatening NATO states. NATO, on paper, is clearly superior to Russia in every regard, with the potential exception of strategic nuclear forces, though the combined nuclear arms of the United States, the United Kingdom, and France bring it to near parity with Russia. This is where NATO, despite its acquisition issues with military production of its members' countries, is relatively stronger than any of its potential European opponents. But this is too myopic of a view of NATO's strength. NATO's true strength, as stated, is its Article 5 guarantees, which are what gives the deterrent credibility. When NATO was comprised of only 12 countries and faced a massive Soviet Red Army in Europe, the existential threat of the Soviet Union to Western Europe's existence ensured that Article 5 would be adhered to without question. The Soviet Union would exploit any gaps in this commitment. NATO's strength was derived from the threat it posed and the unquestioned common goals shared by its members. The question now is, yes, NATO's eastward expansion has made the alliance militarily stronger in both actual and relative terms, but is it really a stronger alliance with more members? Article 5 is the cornerstone of NATO, and the threat posed of the member states have to be sufficient to provide NATO the focus to provide the focus of NATO cohesion to all member countries. Is the Russian threat considered existential enough threat to all 32 members that they would honor Article 5? For example, would a small country in Western Europe feel compelled to sacrifice its lives to protect a smaller country in Eastern Europe, or vice versa? NATO's geographic expanse in Europe means that what is the threat to Latvia's eastern frontiers is not a threat to Spain's western frontiers. Cracks are starting to show in the alliance as Hungary and Slovakia, democratically elected governments, do not view Russia as a threat in the context of the Ukraine war. NATO rules require the unanimous consent of all member nations to make policy decisions, so Slovakia and Hungary, by objecting to NATO policies, are acting within the established rules of NATO, and they are not doing anything wrong. They view security differently from the other 30 NATO members. In the early days of NATO, the nature of the threat relied on a relatively small number of countries, making it easier to gain unanimous consent and adopt more expansive policies, as securing agreement from 12 members was much more manageable. NATO, in its quest for relevance, pursued expansion, but did not change its unanimous consent requirement, which is going to make decision-making considerably more difficult. This is due to the fact that the threat against NATO is no longer existential, and as more countries join, the potential threats continue to diminish. The question now for NATO is, would all members, diversified in geography, culture, and governments, be able to act unanimously to uphold Article 5 in a crisis? For example, if NATO acts without consensus and goes to war with 27 of 32 nations, its strength will be compromised. And at some point, more countries may decide to drop out of the war, further compromising NATO. Will this happen? We don't know for sure because there hasn't been a crisis in Europe, not even the largest land war of World War II going on in Ukraine now, that could lead all 32 countries to agree on a policy. If NATO is to remain viable as a collective defense organization, it needs to narrow its focus on basic issues on which all 32 nations can agree. NATO in its current form is no longer a viable collective security organization. NATO wants to be more aggressive in Ukraine and the Indo-Pacific to counter the Chinese threat to European security, but is unable to reach consensus on either issue. Therefore, NATO needs not only to focus on its most basic mission, which is the collective defense of the international physical borders and potentially cyber warfare to protect itself against a peer adversary. It may also need to create a condition that allows a country to opt out of NATO and leave the alliance without penalty other than it would lose its collective defense and its interoperability with NATO. Other NATO security concerns, such as supplying Ukraine or facing China, could fall under a new defense organization. This would include fewer countries and allow for a more ambitious agenda that would align with a smaller set of nations. Both NATO and this new organization have the potential to include countries in both alliances, and they should collaborate to ensure that their common basic goals are compatible. The new organization should avoid creating circumstances that could lead NATO into a conflict, even if it is not a result of a fundamental NATO policies. This new organization may not be a collective defense organization. Leave that to NATO. It would be a more forward-leaning organization in defense policy and weapons development, as well as ensuring that all developments are compatible with NATO standards. It would operate outside of Europe, the European area, and form associations in Asia to provide Europe with security against a potential threat from China and North Korea. Additionally, given its potential membership of the IPU4 nations, Indo-Pacific 4 nations, the United States, Canada, and European countries, it would also function independently of the European Union. We anticipate a close collaboration between the EU and this new organization as well. NATO leadership was clearly identified potential threats to European security, which is part of NATO's mandate, but the expansive breadth of the NATO membership means that consensus on most policies it wants to pursue is nearly impossible. The NATO war proves that there is a need for NATO, but its expansion has also made it vulnerable to collapsing because of the potential lack of consensus on what justifies an Article 5 violation. Without unanimity of Article 5, the alliance faces certain collapse or paralysis. The best way to save NATO is to narrow its focus and have its members create a new organization of NATO countries and like-minded countries around the world to help secure Europe and the North Atlantic and become a closer partner to NATO but operate outside of it. There are other ways to save NATO, but this is one worth considering.